The old radio hasn't worked in 15 years, but every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, it still plays our song. I'm sitting here on this wooden porch in Cedar Falls, Tennessee, watching the October sun paint the cornfields gold, and I can hear Tennessee Waltz drifting through the static like a whisper from another world. My neighbors think it's just old wires making contact, loose connections sparking memories into music. But I know better. I know it's Walter, trying to tell me something he could never say while his heart was still beating. My name is Dorothy Mae Sullivan, and for 47 years I shared my life with a man who died in silence. For 3 long years before his passing, Walter stopped talking to me. Not completely, mind you, but the conversations dried up like creek beds in summer. Where there used to be laughter over morning coffee, there were only nods. Where there used to be stories about his day at the railroad yard, there were only heavy sighs. I thought he'd stopped loving me. I thought maybe he'd found someone else, or discovered something about me that made him turn away. When emphysema finally took him in 1987, I believed he'd carried all his reasons to the grave. I was wrong. The dead, I've learned, have their own language. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, if you're broken enough, if you're desperate enough to listen, they'll teach you how to hear them. It's been 3 years since Walter left this world, and I'm still learning how to live in a house that feels too big for one person. Cedar Falls isn't much to look at from the outside, just another small Tennessee town where everybody knows everybody's business, and the biggest excitement comes from Friday night football games at the high school. Our house sits on Maple Street, a white clapboard 2-story that Walter built with his own hands back in 1952, when we were young and foolish enough to believe that love and hard work could solve any problem. The front porch wraps around the corner like a welcoming smile, and Walter's workshop still stands in the backyard, tools hanging exactly where he left them, waiting for projects that will never be finished. I'm 82 years old now, and my hands shake more than they used to, but my mind is still sharp as a tack, despite what some folks around here might whisper. Mrs. Henderson from next door brings me casseroles twice a week and always finds an excuse to peer through my windows, checking to make sure I haven't fallen down the stairs or forgotten to turn off the stove. She means well, but I can see the worry in her eyes, the way she talks to me like I'm made of spun glass, ready to shatter at the first strong wind. Pastor Williams stops by every Sunday after church, sits in Walter's old recliner and talks about the weather and the congregation while his eyes dart around the room, cataloging everything, making sure I'm keeping house properly. Even my sister Ruth, who lives up in Nashville, calls every few days with that particular tone in her voice, the one that says she's already mentally packing my belongings for the retirement home. They all think I'm losing my mind, living alone with my memories and my grief. They see an old woman talking to empty rooms, setting 2 plates at dinner time out of habit, keeping Walter's clothes in the closet because the thought of giving them away feels like erasing him completely. What they don't understand is that grief isn't madness, it's love with nowhere to go. And sometimes, just sometimes, love finds a way to circle back home. The days here follow a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. I wake up at 5:30 because that's when Walter always got up for his shift at the railroad, and 47 years of marriage teaches your body to move in sync with another person's schedule, even when that person is gone. I make coffee for 2 and drink both cups, standing at the kitchen window that overlooks the vegetable garden Walter planted every spring. The tomatoes are wild now, growing wherever they please, and the beans have climbed the fence into Mrs. Henderson's yard, but I can't bring myself to tear them up. I spend my mornings reading the Bible and my afternoons in the front yard, pulling weeds and watching the occasional car drive by. Evenings are the hardest, when the house settles into silence and every creak sounds like footsteps, every shadow looks like Walter coming home from work. That's when I sit on the porch with my knitting and wait for something, anything, to break the loneliness that sits on my chest like a stone. The silence started slowly, like most endings do, so gradual you don't notice until it's already taken root in your marriage and grown into something ugly and permanent. Walter and I had always been talkers, the kind of couple who could spend hours on this very porch discussing everything from the price of grain to whether the Hendersons were getting a divorce. He'd come home from the railroad yard with stories about the engineers and the freight loads, complaints about his supervisor, plans for fixing up the house or expanding the garden. I'd tell him about my day, the ladies from church, what I'd heard on the radio while I was cleaning. We had a language all our own, built from 44 years of shared meals and shared beds, inside jokes and gentle arguments about whether to plant corn or soybeans in the back field. But sometime around 1984, Walter's words started disappearing. Not all at once, mind you, but piece by piece, like someone was slowly stealing the conversation right out of our kitchen. At first, I told myself he was just tired. Railroad work is hard on a man's body, and Walter had been coughing more, moving slower, wincing when he thought I wasn't looking. When he stopped telling me about his day, I figured maybe work had gotten boring, the same routines wearing him down into silence. When he stopped asking about my day, I convinced myself he was just distracted, worried about something he didn't want to burden me with. But when he stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped reaching for my hand while we watched television, stopped saying good morning like it meant something, I knew I was losing him to something I couldn't name or fight. The worst part wasn't the quiet, it was the way he looked at me, or rather, the way he stopped looking at me. Walter used to watch me move around the kitchen like I was something beautiful, something worth studying. He'd catch my eye across the dinner table and wink, or brush my shoulder when he walked past my chair. Those little touches disappeared first, then the longer conversations, then the eye contact, until I felt like a stranger living in my own house with a man who had decided I wasn't worth the effort of acknowledgement. I started examining myself in the mirror more carefully, wondering if I'd gotten too old, too gray, too ordinary for him to love. I checked my breath, changed my perfume, bought new dresses and cooked his favorite meals, desperate to bring back the man who used to tell me I was beautiful even when I was covered in flour and garden dirt. Nothing worked. By 1986, we were living like polite roommates, passing salt and making weather observations, but never touching the real business of marriage, never addressing the cold that had settled between us like winter fog. I began to believe that Walter had simply stopped loving me, that maybe he'd found someone younger, or maybe he'd just gotten tired of looking at the same face every morning for 4 decades. I tortured myself imagining him with another woman, someone who could make him laugh again, someone who deserved his words and his attention and his gentle hands. When the emphysema got worse and he spent more time sleeping in his chair than talking to me, I told myself it was the sickness stealing his voice, but deep down I feared it was something much worse. I feared that Walter Sullivan, the man who had promised to love me until death do us part, had already let death take the loving part, leaving me with just the empty shell of obligation and habit. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late September, 3 months after what would have been our 50th wedding anniversary if Walter had lived to see it. I was sitting in the kitchen, picking at a supper I didn't have much appetite for, when I heard something that made my fork clatter against the plate. Music. Soft at first, just a whisper of melody drifting from the living room, but unmistakable all the same. Tennessee waltz, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. My heart stopped, I swear it did, because that radio hasn't made a sound since Walter tried to fix it back in 1975 and gave up in frustration, leaving it sitting on the shelf like a wooden monument to his limitations with electronics. I'd kept it there all these years because it was the radio we'd danced to on our wedding night, the one that played while we moved across the linoleum floor of our first little apartment, me in my blue dress and Walter in his good shirt, both of us pretending we knew how to waltz. For 15 years, that radio had been nothing but decoration, a piece of furniture that collected dust and memories in equal measure. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, and walked toward the living room like I was approaching something holy or dangerous, maybe both. There it was, the old Philco with its wooden case and fabric speaker, glowing warm amber like it had every right in the world to be alive again. The volume was perfect, not too loud, not too soft, just exactly the way Walter used to set it when we'd listen to the evening programs after supper. I reached out to touch the dial, half expecting my fingers to pass right through it like it was made of smoke and wishful thinking, but the wood was solid and warm under my palm. The song played all the way through, every verse, every gentle turn of the melody that I remembered from that night 50 years ago when Walter held me close and promised me forever. When it finished, the radio went quiet again, not crackling with static or humming with electricity, just silent like it had been for the past decade and a half. I stood there in the growing darkness, not daring to move, not wanting to break whatever spell had brought Walter's voice back into this house, because that's what it felt like, his voice calling to me across the years and the grave dirt, telling me he was still here somehow, still watching, still caring enough to send me our song. I waited there for maybe 20 minutes, hoping it would happen again, but the radio remained stubbornly quiet, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right to worry about me. Maybe living alone was finally catching up with my mind, making me hear things that weren't there, see signs where there was only coincidence and loneliness. But when I walked back to the kitchen to clear my barely touched supper, I could swear I caught the faint scent of Walter's aftershave lingering in the air, that Old Spice smell that used to cling to his collar and fill up our bedroom every morning when he got ready for work. I sat back down at the table and finished my meal, chewing slowly and thinking about the way Walter used to hum along with the radio while he read his newspaper after dinner, how he'd tap his fingers against the table in time with the music, how he'd sometimes reach over and squeeze my hand during our favorite songs. For the first time since his funeral, I felt something other than emptiness filling up my chest. It was small and fragile as a bird's egg, but it was hope, pure and simple, and it sang sweeter than any radio ever could. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, but now every creak and whisper seemed like it might be Walter trying to tell me something important. I found myself talking to the darkness, asking him if he was really there, if he'd been the one to turn on the radio, if he was sorry for all those silent years before he died. The darkness didn't answer back, but it felt different somehow, less lonely, like maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The next morning, I woke up convinced I'd dreamed the whole thing. In the cold light of day, with coffee brewing and birds singing outside the window, the idea of a dead radio suddenly coming to life seemed foolish, the kind of nonsense you'd expect from a lonely old woman whose mind was starting to slip. I marched into the living room, determined to prove to myself that I'd imagined it all, but there sat the Philco, looking exactly the same as it had for the past 15 years, its wooden case dusty and its dial pointed to a station that had gone off the air sometime during the Carter administration. I turned the knob, pressed the power button, even gave it a gentle shake, but nothing happened. Not a whisper of sound, not even the static you'd expect from a radio that actually worked. Dead as a doornail, just like Walter. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that grief could play tricks on a person's mind, make them see and hear things that weren't there. I'd read about it in one of those magazine articles they keep at the doctor's office, how widows sometimes think they see their husbands in crowds or hear their voices calling from the next room. It was normal, the article said, part of the healing process, nothing to be ashamed of. But knowing something is normal doesn't make it feel any less crazy when it's happening to you. All day long, I found myself glancing at that radio, waiting for it to flicker back to life, half hoping it would and half dreading what that might mean about the state of my sanity. When Mrs. Henderson came by with her usual Tuesday casserole, she caught me staring at it and asked if everything was all right. I almost told her about the music, almost shared the strange hope that had been growing in my chest since the night before, but something in her expression stopped me. She was looking at me with that particular mixture of pity and concern that people reserve for the elderly and the infirm, like I was a delicate flower that might wilt under too much attention. So instead, I thanked her for the tuna noodle casserole and commented on how nice her hair looked, letting her fuss over me for a few minutes before shooing her back to her own house. But I could see her watching me through her kitchen window for the rest of the afternoon, probably making mental notes to share with Pastor Williams about how Dorothy Sullivan was finally showing signs of losing her grip on reality. That evening, I positioned myself at the kitchen table with a clear view of the living room, determined to catch the radio in the act if it decided to perform again. 6 o'clock came and went without so much as a whisper of sound. I felt foolish sitting there, like a child waiting for Santa Claus, but I couldn't bring myself to leave my post. Maybe Walter only came around on certain days, or maybe I needed to be in exactly the right frame of mind to hear him. Maybe the dead operated on their own schedule, showing up when they pleased rather than when the living needed them most. By 7 o'clock, I was ready to give up and chalk the whole experience up to wishful thinking, but then I remembered something Walter used to say when he was working on a particularly stubborn piece of machinery at the railroad yard. Some things, he'd tell me over supper, only work when they're good and ready, and no amount of forcing will make them cooperate before their time. Maybe that was true for radios that shouldn't work, and maybe it was true for husbands who'd been dead for 3 years. So I waited, and I watched, and I tried to quiet the part of my mind that kept insisting I was losing my grip on what was real and what was just the lonely imaginings of an old woman who missed her husband more than she could bear. The scientific part of me, the part that had helped Walter balance the household books and managed to keep a garden growing for 40 years, demanded logical explanations. Old wiring could short out and make brief connections, couldn't it? Radio waves could travel strange distances under the right atmospheric conditions, couldn't they? There had to be a reasonable explanation for what I'd heard, something that didn't require believing in ghosts or divine intervention or the possibility that love could reach across the grave to comfort the living. But there was another part of me, the part that had spent 47 years learning to recognize the sound of Walter's footsteps on the front porch, the part that could feel him watching me from across a crowded church even before I turned around, the part that had always known things about him without being told. That part of me insisted that what I'd heard was real, that Walter had found a way to send me a message, and that dismissing it as mere coincidence or hallucination would be the greatest betrayal of our marriage I could possibly commit. The battle between faith and reason raged in my mind all week, leaving me exhausted and more isolated than ever. I found myself snapping at well-meaning neighbors, declining invitations to church socials, spending long hours on the porch just watching the world go by and trying to decide whether I was a woman blessed with a miraculous visit from beyond or just another lonely widow whose grief had finally driven her around the bend. By the following Tuesday, I'd made up my mind. I was going to stop fighting what I'd experienced and start paying attention instead. If Walter was trying to reach me from wherever he'd gone, then I owed it to 47 years of marriage to listen, even if it meant the good people of Cedar Falls would start whispering about poor Dorothy Sullivan and her failing mind. I'd spent my whole life being sensible, practical, the kind of woman who trusted facts over feelings and never put much stock in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. But sitting alone in this house night after night, surrounded by Walter's things and Walter's absence, I realized that being sensible hadn't gotten me any answers about why my husband had died in silence or why our last years together had been so cold and distant. Maybe it was time to try being open to possibilities that couldn't be explained by logic or common sense. Maybe it was time to trust that love might be stronger than death, even if admitting that made me sound like a crazy old woman who'd spent too many years alone with her grief. So on that Tuesday evening, I positioned myself in the living room at 5:30, a full half hour before the radio had played the week before, armed with a notebook and pen I'd borrowed from Walter's desk drawer. If something was going to happen, I wanted to document it properly, record every detail so I could study it later and maybe figure out what Walter was trying to tell me. The notebook felt official in my hands, like the ledgers Walter used to keep for tracking household expenses, and writing in it made me feel less foolish about what I was doing. If this was madness, at least it would be organized madness. At exactly 6 o'clock, the radio crackled to life again, and this time I was ready for it. I wrote down the time, the song, the volume level, even the quality of the light in the room and what I'd been thinking about just before it started. Tennessee Waltz again, played from beginning to end with that same warm, clear sound that defied every law of electronics I'd ever learned. When it finished, I sat perfectly still and waited, pen poised over paper, but the silence returned and stayed returned. Still, I'd proven to myself that it wasn't my imagination, that something genuinely strange was happening in this house, and that felt like progress even if I couldn't explain what kind of progress it was. Over the next few weeks, I expanded my documentation project beyond just the radio. I started keeping track of everything unusual, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The way the floorboards in the hallway would creak at 2 in the morning, always in the same pattern, always sounding like footsteps walking from the bedroom to the kitchen and back again. The way the kitchen faucet would drip exactly 7 times every night around 9 o'clock, even though the plumber had fixed it just last month and swore there was nothing wrong with it. The way Walter's coffee cup, the blue one with the chip on the handle that I could never bring myself to throw away, would sometimes appear on the counter in the morning even though I was certain I'd put it away in the cabinet the night before. I wrote it all down, created a calendar of strange events, looked for patterns and connections that might help me understand what Walter was trying to communicate. Some nights, nothing happened at all, and I'd go to bed feeling disappointed and foolish for sitting up with my notebook like a detective investigating a crime that might not even exist. But other nights, the house would come alive with small mysteries, gentle disturbances that felt deliberate and purposeful, like someone was moving through the rooms with intention, trying to catch my attention without frightening me. I began to look forward to these visits, if that's what they were, the way I used to look forward to Walter coming home from work each evening. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, noticed the change in my mood and attributed it to my finally adjusting to widowhood, which was close enough to the truth that I didn't bother correcting her. Pastor Williams commented that I seemed more at peace during Sunday services, and my sister Ruth remarked during one of our phone calls that I sounded almost cheerful for the first time since the funeral. They were right, I was changing, but not in the way they imagined. I was learning to live with mystery, to find comfort in questions that had no obvious answers, to trust that not everything important could be measured or explained or proven to skeptical neighbors. The notebook filled up quickly with my careful observations, and I found myself looking at the house differently, seeing it not as an empty shell where I happened to be living out my remaining years, but as a place where love might still be active, still working to bridge the gap between this world and whatever came after. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started feeling grateful instead, grateful that Walter might be trying to reach me, grateful that death might not be the final word in our conversation, grateful that I'd been chosen to receive whatever message he was working so hard to send. It was a strange kind of faith, built on creaking floorboards and mysterious coffee cups rather than scripture and prayer, but it was faith nonetheless, and it filled up the empty spaces in my heart that grief had carved out and left behind. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in October, when the maple tree outside the living room window had turned the color of fire and the air carried that sharp promise of winter that always made me think of Walter chopping wood for the fireplace. I was washing dishes after a supper of leftover pot roast when I heard a sound that made me drop the plate I was holding right into the soapy water. It was the sound of a drawer sliding open in the living room, that particular wooden whisper that Walter's old writing desk made when you pulled on the handle just right. I dried my hands on my apron and walked toward the sound with my heart hammering against my ribs, because I knew for certain that drawer had been closed when I'd dusted the desk just that morning. There it was, the top drawer pulled out exactly 3 inches, just far enough to reveal the neat stacks of writing paper and envelopes that Walter had always kept organized inside, right next to the fountain pen his father had given him when he graduated from high school. I stood there staring at that drawer for the longest time, afraid to touch it, afraid to close it, afraid that moving would break whatever spell had opened it in the first place. But finally, curiosity got the better of caution, and I reached inside to see if anything looked different from how Walter had left it. That's when my fingers found the folded piece of paper tucked underneath the stack of envelopes, hidden so well that I never would have discovered it if the drawer hadn't opened itself to show me where to look. My hands were shaking as I unfolded that paper, because I recognized Walter's careful handwriting immediately, those neat block letters he'd learned in the army and never changed in all the years I'd known him. The date at the top was September 15, 1986, just 2 months before he died, and it was addressed to me in the formal way he used when he was trying to say something important. "My dearest Dorothy," it began, and I had to sit down in his old recliner because my legs suddenly didn't want to support me anymore. "I am writing this letter because I cannot seem to find the words to say what needs saying while you are looking at me with those worried eyes. I know you think I have stopped loving you. I know you believe that my silence means I have grown tired of our life together, or that I have found fault with you somehow. I see how you watch me at breakfast, searching my face for signs of the man who used to tell you every morning how beautiful you looked. I see how you try harder and harder to please me, cooking my favorite meals and wearing the blue dress I complimented once 20 years ago, and it breaks my heart that my cowardice has made you doubt yourself when you are the finest woman I have ever known." I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes, because the tears were coming so fast they were blurring Walter's careful words, and I couldn't bear to miss a single syllable of what he'd been trying to tell me. When I could see clearly again, I continued reading, and with each sentence, I felt pieces of my broken heart clicking back into place like the gears of a clock that had finally been wound correctly. "The truth is harder to speak than lies, Dorothy, and I have been a coward about the truth for too long. Dr. Peterson told me in July that the emphysema is not the only thing wrong with my lungs. There is cancer there too, spread so far and so fast that nothing can be done to stop it. He gives me 6 months, maybe 8 if I am lucky, and I have spent every day since then trying to figure out how to tell you without destroying what little time we have left together. But the words stick in my throat like sawdust, and every time I look at you, I see not the woman I am going to leave behind, but the woman I fell in love with 50 years ago, dancing in that little apartment above Mercer's grocery store, trusting me to take care of her forever. How do I tell that woman that I am going to break the most important promise I ever made? How do I put that burden on your shoulders when you have carried so much for our family already?" The letter went on for 3 more pages, each paragraph revealing more of the agony Walter had been carrying alone during those final months of his life. He wrote about lying awake at night, listening to me breathe beside him and knowing that soon I would be sleeping alone. He wrote about watching me tend the garden and wondering who would help me with the heavy work when he was gone. He wrote about all the conversations he wanted to have with me, all the memories he wanted to share one more time, all the ways he wanted to tell me he loved me, but how the weight of his secret made every word feel like a lie because it wasn't the whole truth. He explained that he'd started pulling away not because he loved me less, but because he loved me too much to watch me start grieving while he was still alive to see it. "I thought," he wrote, "that if I began this separation slowly, if I taught you to live without my conversation and my attention, it might be easier for you when the final separation came. I see now that this was the wrong choice, that my silence hurt you more than my honesty would have, but by the time I realized my mistake, I had waited so long that telling you seemed more cruel than continuing to protect you from the truth." The last paragraph was the hardest to read, because Walter's handwriting had gotten shaky, like his hands were trembling when he wrote it. "I am running out of time to be brave, Dorothy, and I fear I will take this secret to my grave rather than find the courage to speak it aloud. If that happens, if I die without explaining why I became a stranger to you in our final years together, I hope you will know that every silent day was filled with love I could not figure out how to express. I hope you will forgive a foolish old man who thought he could protect you from sorrow by carrying it alone. I hope you will remember the Walter who danced with you and laughed with you and built this life with you, not the Walter who forgot how to speak when speaking mattered most. You were the best part of every day I was blessed to live, and if there is any way to love you from beyond this world, I promise I will find it. Your devoted husband, Walter." I sat in that chair and cried until I thought I might turn myself inside out with the force of it, cried for all the words Walter had wanted to say but couldn't, cried for the months of silence that had been love disguised as indifference, cried for the pain he'd carried alone to spare me from sharing it. But mixed in with the grief was a relief so profound it felt like being born again, because finally, I understood that Walter hadn't stopped loving me at all. He had loved me so much that he'd sacrificed his own need for comfort and connection to try to make my eventual loss easier to bear. It was a misguided kindness, the kind of protective gesture that men of his generation thought made them strong, but it was kindness nonetheless, and knowing that transformed every memory I had of those final months together. But that first letter was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, it seemed like Walter had orchestrated an entire treasure hunt from beyond the grave, leaving me clues and messages in places I never would have thought to look if he hadn't been guiding me there with his mysterious signals. The pattern was always the same: something small and seemingly innocent would happen, a book would fall off a shelf or a cabinet door would swing open on its own, and when I investigated, I'd find another piece of the puzzle Walter had been trying to leave for me. Behind the loose floorboard in the bedroom closet, the one that had squeaked for years but never bothered us enough to fix, I discovered a shoebox containing dozens of photographs I'd never seen before. Pictures of me working in the garden, hanging laundry on the line, reading on the front porch, all taken with the little camera Walter carried to work sometimes but claimed he never used. The photos spanned our entire marriage, from young woman to middle age to the gray-haired version of myself I'd become in his final years, and on the back of each one, he'd written the date and a small note in his careful handwriting. Dorothy planting tomatoes, spring 1963. Most beautiful woman in Tennessee. My wife reading her book, summer 1971. Lucky man. Dorothy at 60, still takes my breath away. There were hundreds of them, a secret documentation of his love that he'd been creating and hiding for decades, proof that he'd been paying attention to me even when I thought he wasn't, that he'd found me worth photographing and keeping and treasuring long after most husbands stopped noticing their wives at all. I spent an entire afternoon going through those pictures, amazed by the woman I saw in them, because Walter's camera had captured someone I barely recognized as myself. In his photographs, I wasn't the plain, aging farm wife I saw in the mirror every morning, but someone radiant and beloved, someone worth watching and recording and preserving for posterity. He'd caught me laughing at something one of the grandchildren had said, concentrating on a difficult piece of embroidery, singing while I kneaded bread, and in every image, I could see what Walter saw when he looked at me, the beauty that his love had created and sustained even when I couldn't see it myself. The kitchen timer, which had been broken for over a year, suddenly started working again and would ring at odd moments throughout the day, always when I was standing near a place where Walter had hidden something for me to find. It led me to the coffee can in the pantry where he'd tucked away every love note I'd ever written him, from the silly messages I used to slip into his lunch pail to the anniversary card I'd given him the year before he died. It guided me to the toolbox in the garage, where I found a manila envelope containing the deed to a small plot of land outside town that Walter had apparently bought as a surprise for our retirement, planning to build me the dream house he'd never had the chance to mention. It directed me to the attic, where I discovered a cedar chest I'd never noticed before, filled with fabric he'd been secretly collecting for years, enough material to keep me in sewing projects for the rest of my life, all in patterns and colors he knew I loved. Each discovery felt like receiving a gift from Walter personally, as if he were standing beside me, watching my face light up with surprise and joy, pleased that his careful planning was finally coming to fruition. But more than the physical objects, it was the thoughtfulness behind them that overwhelmed me, the evidence that Walter had spent years of our marriage thinking about ways to make me happy, planning surprises and collecting tokens of his affection even during the periods when I'd thought he was indifferent to my existence. The man who had seemed so silent and distant in his final years had actually been busy creating a legacy of love that would sustain me long after he was gone, and the fact that he'd found a way to deliver it to me posthumously was the most romantic gesture he'd ever made in 47 years of marriage. I began to understand that Walter's silence hadn't been about love ending, but about love being too overwhelming to express in ordinary words. He'd been a man who showed his feelings through actions rather than speeches, and his final actions had been to prepare a series of discoveries that would prove to me, long after his death, exactly how much I had meant to him. The radio continued to play our song every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, but now I heard it differently, not as a mysterious message from the beyond, but as Walter's way of announcing that another gift was waiting to be found, another piece of his heart was ready to be revealed. I stopped being afraid of the supernatural aspects of what was happening and started looking forward to them instead, because each strange occurrence brought me closer to understanding the man I'd been married to for nearly half a century, the man who had loved me more deeply than I'd ever imagined possible. Everything changed the night Mrs. Henderson saw the lights. I was in the living room, going through another box of Walter's hidden treasures that had mysteriously appeared on the kitchen table that morning, when I heard her frantic knocking on my front door. It was nearly 10 o'clock, well past the time when decent folks in Cedar Falls were usually tucked into bed, and Mrs. Henderson was standing on my porch in her bathrobe and curlers, clutching a flashlight and looking like she'd seen something that had scared her right out of her evening routine. "Dorothy," she said, her voice high and shaky, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Have you been having electrical problems in this house?" I invited her in and made her a cup of tea while she explained what had brought her over in such a state. According to Mrs. Henderson, she'd been lying in bed reading when she noticed lights flickering in my windows, not the steady glow of lamps being turned on and off, but something more erratic, like candles or maybe faulty wiring causing problems throughout the house. She'd watched for nearly an hour, she said, seeing lights appear in different rooms in a pattern that didn't make sense for one person moving around a house, almost like multiple people were walking through the rooms at the same time, turning lights on behind them as they went. The strange thing was, I hadn't noticed anything unusual about the lights myself, but when Mrs. Henderson described what she'd seen, it matched perfectly with my own sense that the house had been more active than usual lately, filled with small movements and quiet disturbances that felt like Walter was getting bolder about making his presence known. I found myself caught between wanting to tell her the truth about everything I'd been experiencing and knowing that the truth would only confirm her worst fears about my mental state. So I told her a partial truth, that I'd been having some minor electrical issues, probably old wiring that needed attention, and I promised to call an electrician in the morning to take a look at things. Mrs. Henderson seemed satisfied with this explanation, but I could see in her eyes that she was filing away this incident as further evidence that Dorothy Sullivan needed more supervision than she was getting. After she left, I sat in the dark living room and thought about how thin the line was between miracle and madness, between receiving a gift from heaven and losing your grip on reality. What if Mrs. Henderson was right to be concerned? What if all these months of mysterious radio music and hidden letters and appearing objects were just symptoms of a mind that was finally breaking down under the weight of loneliness and grief? What if Walter wasn't reaching out to me from beyond the grave, but my own desperate need for his presence was creating elaborate fantasies that felt real enough to convince me they were actually happening? The thought terrified me more than any ghost ever could, because it meant that everything I'd been finding, all the love letters and photographs and carefully hidden treasures, might be things I'd always known were there but had forgotten in my grief, my mind playing tricks on me by making their rediscovery feel supernatural and meaningful. Maybe the radio was just old wiring making random connections, and maybe the lights Mrs. Henderson had seen were just the confused wanderings of an old woman who couldn't remember turning them on and off. Maybe the drawer had opened because the wood was warped and the house was settling, and maybe I'd been talking to empty air for months while my neighbors watched through their windows and worried about when to call my sister Ruth and suggest it was time to start looking at nursing homes. The doubt crept into my mind like cold water, washing away the warm certainty I'd been building up over weeks of careful documentation and growing faith. By morning, I was convinced that I needed to test myself, to find out once and for all whether Walter was really communicating with me or whether I was just a lonely old woman whose grief had finally driven her past the point of rational thinking. I decided to ask Walter for a sign, something specific and unmistakable that couldn't be explained away by faulty wiring or forgotten memories or the wishful thinking of a widow who missed her husband more than she could bear. If he was really there, if this was all real, then he would find a way to prove it to me beyond any shadow of doubt. And if nothing happened, if no sign came, then I would know it was time to accept that I was losing my mind and start making arrangements for whatever came next. The sign I asked for came the very next morning, and it was so clear and unmistakable that even Mrs. Henderson couldn't have explained it away with talk of faulty wiring or settling foundations. I woke up to find Walter's old leather satchel, the one he'd carried to work every day for 30 years, sitting open on the kitchen table with a stack of papers inside that I'd never seen before. The satchel had been hanging in the bedroom closet since his funeral, and I knew for certain it had been empty because I'd checked it myself when I was going through his belongings. But there it was, filled with documents that told a story I wasn't prepared to hear, medical records and doctor's bills and insurance papers that painted a picture of the last 2 years of Walter's life that was completely different from the one I'd been living through. The first paper I picked up was a diagnosis report from Dr. Peterson, dated March 15, 1985, almost 2 years before Walter died. Lung cancer, stage 4, metastasized to the liver and lymph nodes, prognosis 6 to 8 months with treatment, 3 to 4 months without. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense, because Walter had never mentioned cancer, never said anything about treatments or prognosis or counting down the months he had left. According to these papers, he'd been dying for almost 2 full years while I thought he was just pulling away from me out of boredom or disappointment or the simple erosion of love over time. There were appointment records showing that Walter had been seeing Dr. Peterson twice a month, getting chemotherapy treatments at the county hospital while I believed he was working overtime shifts at the railroad yard. There were prescription receipts for pain medications I'd never seen him take, bills for medical equipment I'd never seen in our house, insurance claims for procedures that had apparently been keeping him alive long enough to arrange his affairs and prepare for the end he knew was coming. The most devastating discovery was a letter from Dr. Peterson to Walter, dated just 6 weeks before he died, explaining why the treatments weren't working anymore and discussing options for hospice care. Mr. Sullivan, the letter read, I understand your desire to protect your wife from knowing the full extent of your condition, but I must advise you that attempting to manage your pain and symptoms without her knowledge will become increasingly difficult as the disease progresses. I strongly encourage you to consider telling Mrs. Sullivan about your diagnosis so that she can help you through the final stages and make informed decisions about your care. Walter's response was clipped to the back of the letter, written in his careful handwriting on a piece of notebook paper. Doctor, my wife has been through enough hardship in her life without watching me die by inches in front of her eyes. I would rather she remember me as the man who loved her than the man who withered away in her living room. Please continue the treatments as long as they are effective, and when they are no longer helping, I will handle the rest my own way. I do not want Dorothy to become a nurse to a dying man when she deserves to remain a wife to a living one for as long as possible. As I read through page after page of medical records, I began to understand the enormous effort Walter had put into maintaining the illusion that he was healthy, the careful choreography of doctor's appointments scheduled during work hours, medications hidden where I would never find them, symptoms managed privately so I wouldn't worry. The nausea he'd blamed on something he ate, the fatigue he'd attributed to getting older, the weight loss he'd explained away as trying to eat healthier, all of it had been the cancer eating him alive while he pretended everything was normal. The silence that had hurt me so deeply hadn't been indifference at all, but the desperate action of a man who was using every ounce of his remaining strength to protect me from the truth. He'd withdrawn from me not because he'd stopped loving me, but because he'd loved me too much to let me watch him suffer, too much to burden me with the knowledge that every conversation might be our last, too much to turn me into a caregiver when he wanted me to remain his wife. I found treatment schedules that showed he'd been getting chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday for over a year, which explained why he'd always been so tired on Wednesday and Friday evenings, why he'd started going to bed earlier and sleeping later, why he'd sometimes winced when I hugged him too tightly. I discovered bills for a wig he'd apparently bought and never wore, because the chemotherapy had been causing his hair to thin, and medications for mouth sores and neuropathy and all the other cruel side effects that came with trying to poison cancer out of a body without killing the body itself. There were notes in his handwriting, reminders to himself about which pills to take when, observations about his symptoms, even a crude calendar where he'd been marking good days and bad days, trying to predict when he'd be able to function normally around me and when he'd need to find excuses to be alone with his pain. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of letters he'd written to me but never sent, one for each month of his illness, documenting his thoughts and feelings as the cancer progressed and as time grew shorter. In the early letters, he was optimistic about hiding his condition, confident that he could protect me from the worst of it and maybe even beat the odds. But as the months went on, his tone grew more desperate, filled with regret about the distance his secret was creating between us and anguish about the pain he was causing me by pulling away. "I see how you look at me now," he wrote in one letter dated just 3 months before he died, "like you're trying to solve a puzzle that has no solution. I see you examining yourself in the mirror, wondering what you've done wrong, why I've stopped reaching for you in the dark. It breaks my heart to let you think you're somehow at fault for my withdrawal, but telling you the truth feels like handing you a burden too heavy for anyone to carry. I am caught between protecting you from my death and protecting you from my life, and I fear I am failing at both." The final letter in the stack was dated just 1 week before Walter died, and his handwriting was so shaky I could barely read it. "Dorothy, if you are reading this, then I have failed to find the courage to tell you face to face what you deserved to know all along. I am dying, my love, and I have been dying for a long time, and every day of silence between us has been my clumsy attempt to give you a few more months of happiness before grief comes to claim you. I know now that this was wrong, that my silence hurt you more than my honesty would have, but by the time I realized my mistake, I had waited so long that telling you seemed crueler than continuing the lie. Please forgive me for choosing to die alone rather than live honestly. Please remember that every quiet day was filled with love I didn't know how to express without also expressing goodbye." I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like hours, surrounded by the evidence of Walter's elaborate deception and overwhelming love, and felt something inside me break open like a dam that had been holding back a lifetime of unshed tears. The grief that poured out wasn't just for Walter's death anymore, but for all the pain he'd carried alone, all the fear he'd swallowed down to spare me from sharing it, all the conversations we'd never had because he thought silence was kindness. I grieved for the Walter who'd sat in doctors' offices hearing his death sentence while I was at home wondering why he didn't want to talk to me anymore. I grieved for the nights he'd lain awake beside me, probably praying for just a few more weeks, a few more days, while I lay awake wondering if he was thinking about leaving me for another woman. I grieved for the mornings when he'd gotten up early to vomit from chemotherapy, then come back to bed and pretended to be sleeping peacefully while I got dressed for church. Most of all, I grieved for my own blindness, my own failure to see past my hurt feelings to the man who was dying quietly beside me, asking for nothing, protecting me from everything, loving me with a ferocity that required him to break my heart in order to spare me something even worse. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so wrapped up in my own feelings of rejection that I couldn't see the exhaustion in his eyes, the careful way he moved when he thought I wasn't looking, the deliberate distance he maintained not out of indifference but out of desperate, misguided love? I thought about all the times I'd tried to get him to talk to me those last 2 years, all the meals I'd cooked to try to win back his attention, all the nights I'd lain beside him feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. If I'd been paying closer attention, if I'd been less focused on my own wounded pride and more focused on the man I'd promised to love in sickness and in health, would I have noticed what was really happening? Would I have been able to convince him to let me share the burden he was carrying, to let me be his partner in facing death instead of leaving me to face widowhood unprepared and confused? The questions tormented me because they had no answers, because Walter was gone and I couldn't go back and do it differently, couldn't insist on knowing the truth he'd worked so hard to hide from me. But as I sat there drowning in regret and revelation, something extraordinary happened. The radio in the living room crackled to life, not with Tennessee Waltz this time, but with the sound of Walter's voice, clear as if he were sitting right beside me at the kitchen table. "Dorothy," his voice said, and it was unmistakably him, the same warm drawl that had said my name every morning for 47 years, "I need you to listen to me now, because I don't know how long I can make this work." I ran to the living room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and stared at the radio that was glowing with that familiar amber light. Walter's voice continued, gentle but urgent, like he was working against time. I can see you found the papers, and I can see how much they're hurting you, and that's the last thing I wanted. I hid my sickness from you because I couldn't bear to watch you start grieving while I was still here to love you. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was protecting myself too, protecting myself from having to say goodbye, from having to admit that all our plans and dreams were going to end before we were ready. His voice paused, and I could hear that familiar catch in his breathing that I'd attributed to his emphysema but now knew was something much worse. You need to know that every silent day was filled with words I wanted to say but couldn't find the courage to speak. Every time I pulled away from you, I was really pulling you closer to my heart, holding you so tight in my love that I was afraid if I loosened my grip even a little bit, I might lose you before I lost everything else. You need to know that when I stopped reaching for you in the dark, it wasn't because I didn't want you, it was because I was afraid you'd feel how much weight I'd lost, how my body was betraying us both. When I stopped telling you about my day, it wasn't because nothing interesting happened, it was because everything that happened reminded me that my days were numbered and I couldn't bear to number yours along with mine. I sank into Walter's old recliner, clutching the arms so tightly my knuckles went white, afraid to move or breathe or do anything that might break this impossible connection. Dorothy, my darling girl, I need you to forgive me for choosing to die alone rather than live honestly with you beside me. I need you to forgive me for loving you so much that I forgot you were strong enough to love me back, even through the worst of it. I need you to understand that every day I spent dying was a day I spent loving you, and that keeping my sickness secret was the last gift I knew how to give you, even though it was the wrong gift, even though what you needed was not protection but partnership. Walter's voice grew softer, more distant, like he was speaking from very far away. I'm running out of time, and whatever power is letting me speak to you now is fading fast, so I need to say the most important thing while I still can. You were not just the love of my life, Dorothy May, you were the life in my love, the reason I fought so hard and so long to stay, the reason I couldn't bear to let you watch me leave. Every breath I took for those last 2 years was borrowed time I spent trying to figure out how to love you forever, and I think I've finally found the way. The way is this: I am teaching you to hear me when I cannot speak, to feel me when I cannot touch, to know me when I cannot be known. The way is showing you that love doesn't end with death, it just changes its language, and if you learn to speak that language, we will never really be apart. The radio fell silent then, not gradually fading but stopping abruptly, like someone had turned off a switch, leaving me alone in the quiet living room with my tears and my broken heart and my overwhelming gratitude for this final, impossible gift from the man who had loved me too much to live honestly and too much to die quietly. I sat in that chair for the rest of the night, not moving, barely breathing, replaying Walter's words over and over in my mind until I had memorized every syllable, every pause, every breath. The radio remained silent, its amber glow faded to black, and somehow I knew that this had been our final conversation, that whatever force had allowed Walter to reach across the divide between life and death had used up all its power in those precious few minutes of honest communication. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the living room windows, I finally understood what I needed to do. I needed to say goodbye properly, the way we should have said goodbye 2 years ago if Walter had found the courage to tell me the truth and I had found the wisdom to see past my own hurt feelings. I needed to release him from the guilt he'd been carrying in whatever realm he now inhabited, and I needed to release myself from the anger and confusion that had been poisoning my grief since the day he died. I walked to the kitchen table where all his medical records were still scattered like pieces of a puzzle I'd finally learned how to solve, and I gathered them into a neat stack, handling each paper with the reverence I would have shown a love letter, because that's what they were, in their own way. Every hidden doctor's appointment, every secret treatment, every carefully concealed symptom had been Walter's way of writing "I love you" in a language I hadn't known how to read while he was alive. I put on my coat and walked out to the backyard, to the spot where Walter had always talked about wanting to plant a rose garden but never found the time. The ground was hard with the first frost of winter, but I managed to dig a small hole with the trowel from his tool shed, working slowly and deliberately in the weak morning light. Into that hole, I placed all the medical records, all the hidden letters, all the evidence of Walter's elaborate deception and overwhelming love. Before I covered them with earth, I spoke to him one last time, not hoping for an answer but needing to say the words anyway. "Walter," I said to the cold air and the sleeping garden, "I forgive you for protecting me when I wanted to protect you. I forgive you for loving me so much that you forgot I was strong enough to love you back through anything. I forgive you for choosing to die alone, and I forgive myself for not seeing what you were hiding from me. But most of all, Walter, I thank you. I thank you for fighting so long and so hard to stay with me, for enduring treatments that must have been agony just to buy us a few more months together, even if I didn't know they were borrowed time. I thank you for finding a way to tell me the truth after death when you couldn't find the courage to tell me before. And I thank you for teaching me that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like, that sometimes love looks like silence, sometimes it looks like distance, sometimes it looks like secrets kept to spare the heart that's already carrying more than its share of sorrow." I covered the papers with dirt and patted down the small mound with my hands, then I went back inside and called Pastor Williams. When he answered, I told him I needed to speak with him about Walter, about grief, about the way love can disguise itself as abandonment when people are too afraid to say goodbye. I didn't tell him about the radio or the mysterious appearances of Walter's hidden letters, because those were private miracles that belonged only to me and Walter, sacred communications that wouldn't survive being explained to skeptical ears. But I told him about the medical records, about Walter's secret illness, about the elaborate deception that had been motivated by love rather than indifference. Pastor Williams listened without judgment, offered comfort without condescension, and when I finished talking, he said something that helped me understand why this revelation had come now, 3 years after Walter's death, rather than sooner when the pain might have been easier to bear. "Sometimes," he said, "we're not ready to receive certain truths when they're first offered to us. Sometimes our hearts need time to grow big enough to hold revelations that would have crushed us if they'd come before we were prepared." Maybe Walter knew that you needed 3 years to get strong enough to carry the weight of his love without being destroyed by it. That afternoon, I went through the house one more time, returning Walter's photographs to their hiding places, putting away the letters and mementos that had been revealed to me over the past few months. Not because I wanted to forget what I'd learned, but because I understood now that these treasures had served their purpose. They had delivered Walter's message, bridged the gap between his silence and my understanding, and now they could rest quietly in their chosen places, available if I ever needed reminding of the depth of his love, but no longer necessary for my daily survival. The radio never played again after that night, and the house settled into a different kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of abandonment I'd been living with since Walter's death, but the peaceful silence of completion, of a story that had finally found its proper ending. The weeks that followed Walter's final message brought a kind of peace I hadn't felt since before his illness began, though I didn't know at the time that's what I was feeling. For 3 years, I'd been carrying the weight of unanswered questions, the terrible uncertainty of not knowing why the man I'd loved for nearly half a century had turned away from me in his final years. Now that I understood his silence had been love disguised as distance, protection disguised as rejection, I could finally grieve properly, not for a marriage that had failed but for a husband who had loved me too much to let me share his burden. The anger that had been eating away at my heart like acid began to dissolve, replaced by a sadness that was clean and honest, the kind of grief that heals rather than poisons. I found myself talking to Walter differently now, not with the desperate pleading of someone trying to reach across an impossible divide, but with the comfortable intimacy of someone continuing a conversation that had been interrupted but never really ended. I told him about my days, about the changing seasons, about the small happenings in Cedar Falls that I thought might interest him. I shared my memories of our life together, but now I could include the difficult final years without bitterness, understanding them as part of the love story rather than its destruction. Mrs. Henderson noticed the change in me, though she couldn't have said exactly what was different. "You seem more like yourself lately," she told me one afternoon when she came by with her weekly casserole offering. More settled, somehow. Less. She searched for the right word, less restless, I suppose. Like you found some peace with Walter being gone. She was right, though I couldn't explain to her that my peace had come not from accepting Walter's absence but from understanding his presence, not from learning to live without him but from learning to live with a different version of him, one that existed in the careful arrangements he'd made to love me beyond death. I began to see our house differently, not as a tomb where I was serving time until my own death came to claim me, but as a testament to Walter's enduring care for my well-being. Every room held evidence of his thoughtfulness, from the sturdy shelves he'd built to hold my books to the extra insulation he'd installed to keep me warm through Tennessee winters. The vegetable garden that had grown wild in his absence became beautiful in its wilderness, a living demonstration that some things continue to flourish even when the gardener is gone. I started taking better care of myself, not out of any sudden enthusiasm for life but out of respect for the man who had sacrificed so much to preserve my happiness. I cooked proper meals instead of picking at leftovers, kept the house clean and welcoming the way Walter had always liked it, tended to my appearance with the care of someone who knew she was still beloved even if the one who loved her could no longer say so aloud. The loneliness didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed from the sharp ache of abandonment into the gentler sorrow of missing someone who had been forced to leave rather than someone who had chosen to go. Winter settled over Cedar Falls with unusual gentleness that year, bringing soft snows instead of the harsh blizzards that usually marked the season. I spent long evenings reading by the fireplace Walter had built with his own hands, sometimes hearing his voice in the crackling of the logs, sometimes catching a whiff of his aftershave in the smoke that drifted back down the chimney when the wind was wrong. These small visitations no longer startled me or filled me with desperate hope for more substantial contact. Instead, they felt like the natural rhythm of a love that had learned to exist without physical presence, like echoes of Walter's devotion continuing to reverberate through the spaces we had shared. I began to understand that grief wasn't something to be cured or overcome but something to be transformed, the way coal becomes diamond under pressure, the way winter becomes spring through patience rather than force. The raw pain of Walter's death had been refined through revelation into something precious and sustaining, a sorrow that connected me to him rather than separating me from life. On quiet evenings, I would sit in Walter's old recliner and imagine I could feel the impression his body had left in the worn cushions, and instead of making me sad, this reminder of his physical presence brought comfort, proof that love leaves marks on the world that outlast the lover, that some impressions run too deep to be erased by time or death. I stopped waiting for miracles and started recognizing the miraculous in ordinary things. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, the way the house settled into sleep with sounds that reminded me of Walter's breathing, the way my own hands had begun to move like his when I worked in the garden, unconsciously mimicking gestures I'd watched for 47 years. This was Walter's final gift to me, I realized, this ability to find him everywhere and nowhere, to live with his absence without being destroyed by it, to carry his love forward into whatever time I had left without the weight of unanswered questions or unresolved regrets. Spring came early to Cedar Falls that year, and with it came an opportunity one never would have expected. Pastor Williams approached me after Sunday service with a request that at first seemed impossible but gradually revealed itself as exactly what I needed to complete my own healing. The church had been asked to provide grief counseling for a group of war widows from the Veterans Administration Hospital, women whose husbands had died from various service-related illnesses, and Pastor Williams wondered if I might be willing to share my experience with them. "I've watched you these past months, Dorothy," he said as we stood in the church parking lot watching the congregation disperse to their Sunday dinners, "and I've seen something in you change, something settle. You found a way to live with loss that gives you strength rather than taking it away, and I think these ladies could benefit from hearing how you did that." At first, I protested that I had no special wisdom to offer, that my situation was different from theirs, that I wasn't trained in counseling or psychology or any of the official ways of helping people deal with grief. But Pastor Williams persisted, and eventually I agreed to meet with the group, thinking I might be able to offer them some small comfort by sharing Walter's story and what I'd learned about love's ability to transcend death. The first meeting was held in the church basement on a rainy Thursday evening in April, and I found myself facing 6 women ranging in age from 40 to 70, all of them carrying the particular weight that comes from losing a spouse to a long, difficult illness. As they introduced themselves and told their stories, I heard echoes of my own experience in their words: husbands who had withdrawn during their final months, wives who blamed themselves for not doing enough, families torn apart by the stress of watching someone they loved slip away despite all efforts to save them. But what struck me most was how many of them were struggling with the same questions that had tormented me for 3 years. Why had their husbands become distant? Why had they stopped communicating? Why had love seemed to disappear precisely when it was needed most? As I listened to their pain, I realized that Walter's story wasn't unique, that many men of his generation dealt with terminal illness the same way he had, by trying to protect their families from the full weight of their suffering. I began to share what I'd learned about the difference between love that speaks and love that protects through silence, about how sometimes the most caring thing a dying person can do is try to shield their loved ones from the reality of what's coming, even if that shielding causes different kinds of pain. I told them about Walter's hidden medical records, about his secret treatments, about the elaborate lengths he'd gone to in order to maintain the illusion that he was merely getting older rather than dying by degrees. I shared his letters, the ones where he explained his reasoning, his fear, his desperate desire to give me a few more months of normalcy before grief claimed me completely. As I spoke, I watched these women's faces change, saw recognition dawning in their eyes as they began to understand their own husband's final years in a new light. One woman, Margaret, whose husband had died of Agent Orange poisoning, began to cry as she realized that his angry outbursts and rejection of her care hadn't been about not loving her anymore, but about not wanting her to see him reduced to someone who needed care. Another, Eleanor, understood for the first time why her husband had insisted on sleeping in the guest room during his final months, not because he didn't want to be close to her, but because he didn't want her to feel the fever and restlessness that kept him awake most nights. We met every Thursday for 2 months, and each week brought new revelations as these women re-examined their marriages through the lens of protective love rather than abandonment. I watched them transition from anger and confusion to understanding and gratitude, saw them begin to honor their husbands' final acts of devotion rather than dwelling on what had felt like rejection. But something unexpected happened during those meetings. I found that helping them heal was completing my own healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. By speaking Walter's story aloud, by putting his love into words that others could understand and find comfort in, I was finally giving voice to all the things he hadn't been able to say while he was alive. In a strange way, I was becoming Walter's voice, carrying his message of protective love to other women who needed to hear it, fulfilling his desire to spare people from unnecessary pain by helping them understand that sometimes love looks like distance when it can't bear to look like goodbye. By the time our group disbanded in June, all of us had been transformed. These women had found peace with their husbands' deaths, and I had found purpose in my widowhood. I had learned that Walter's final gift to me wasn't just the revelation of his love, but the opportunity to use that revelation to help others find their way through the labyrinth of grief to the peaceful meadow that waits on the other side. I finally understood that some stories are meant to be shared, that some pain is meant to be transformed into wisdom, and that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to use what they taught us to comfort the living. It's been 5 years now since Walter died, and I'm sitting on this same porch where I started telling you this story, watching another October sunset paint the Tennessee sky in shades of gold and crimson. The radio is still there on the living room shelf, silent as it's been since that last night when Walter found the strength to speak to me one final time. I don't need it to play anymore, because I've learned to hear his voice in other places, in the wind that moves through the maple tree he planted for our 25th anniversary, in the steady rhythm of the train that still passes at 6 o'clock every evening, in the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived that he taught me to recognize and cherish. Mrs. Henderson still brings me casseroles twice a week, but now she sits with me on the porch afterward and we talk about her own fears of losing her husband, and I'm able to offer her the kind of comfort that only comes from having walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged into sunlight on the other side. The ladies from our grief group still call me regularly, and some of them have started their own support groups in neighboring towns, spreading the understanding that Walter died to give me and I lived to share with them. The house feels different now, not empty but full of a presence that doesn't require physical form to be real. Walter's tools still hang in the garage exactly where he left them, but now when I look at them, I see not the remnants of an interrupted life but the carefully organized legacy of a man who believed in being prepared for whatever work needed doing. His clothes still hang in the bedroom closet, not because I can't bear to give them away, but because they smell like love and devotion and the particular brand of protective sacrifice that some people call silence and I now know to call tenderness. I've started working in the garden again, planting the rose bushes Walter always talked about but never had time to put in the ground. Every spring brings new blooms, red and pink and yellow flowers that shouldn't be able to grow in this rocky Tennessee soil but somehow manage to flourish anyway, the way love sometimes manages to flourish in the rocky soil of loss and separation and misunderstood intentions. When people ask me how I've managed to find peace after everything I went through, I tell them the truth, that love doesn't end with death, it just changes its language, and if you're willing to learn that new language, you'll discover that the conversation never really stops, it just gets quieter, more subtle, more dependent on faith than sight. I tell them that Walter never actually left me, he just moved to a place where I have to listen with my heart instead of my ears, where I have to look with my soul instead of my eyes, where I have to trust in promises that can't be proven but can be felt in the marrow of my bones. Tonight, like every night, I'll go inside and set 2 places at the dinner table, not out of habit or confusion or the stubborn refusal to accept reality, but out of the certainty that love sets a place at every table, reserves a space in every conversation, keeps a light burning in every window for the ones who have gone ahead to prepare the way for those who will follow when their own time comes. As I sit here in the gathering dusk, with the first stars beginning to appear over Cedar Falls and the familiar sounds of evening settling around me like a comfortable quilt, I want you to know something important about the story I've just shared with you. Walter's voice didn't just reach me after the grave to comfort one lonely widow in a small Tennessee town. His voice reaches every person who has ever loved someone enough to make sacrifices they thought were protecting them, every person who has ever been left behind wondering if they were truly loved, every person who has ever discovered that the deepest love sometimes speaks in the language of silence. The truth Walter taught me from beyond death is this: love doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures and constant communication. Sometimes love whispers. Sometimes love protects by staying quiet. Sometimes love creates distance not because it's ending, but because it's trying to spare the beloved from sharing unbearable pain. And sometimes, if we're very blessed and very patient, love finds a way to explain itself after all the earthly opportunities for explanation have passed. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it's helped you understand your own grief or your own love or your own unanswered questions in a new way, then Walter's voice has reached you too. That's how love works when it's strong enough and pure enough and patient enough to transcend the boundaries between life and death. It doesn't stop with one person or one family or one small town. It spreads like ripples in a pond, touching hearts and healing wounds and bringing understanding to places where confusion used to live. I'd be grateful if you'd share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be sitting in their own kitchen wondering why love went quiet when they needed it most. And if you'd like to hear more stories about the way love persists and the way the dead find ways to comfort the living, I hope you'll stay connected with us here. Because I've learned that when we share our stories of love and loss and unexpected grace, we create a community where nobody has to grieve alone, where every widow knows she might still be a wife in ways that matter more than words can say. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the space between what's said and what's understood, between what's lost and what remains, between the silence of death and the whisper of eternal love. If Walter's voice reached your heart today, if this story helped you understand something about love or loss or the way silence can sometimes be the deepest form of caring, please let me know in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that love doesn't end with death, it just learns to speak a different language. Subscribe for more stories about the way love persists, because every widow has a story, and every story has the power to heal someone else's broken heart. Until next time, remember, the most important conversations sometimes happen in the silence between words.